And it's important that you know that part of why I wanted to be ordained here was because the journey began here. 7 or 8 years ago, I had contact with Father Jim Kent through the internet about the possibility of a vocation with Franciscan life. And I can remember the night that I came here. It was this Thursday night, and we had evening prayer here in this chapel. And so this place, as a place of prayer and a place of worship, will always be precious to me. But as you might think would happen, at a time like this for me, with so many changes, and then also encountering people that I've known and loved, I confess I've been a little bit nostalgic. And in talking with my brother Jim and my sister Nancy and our family, we've been kind of recounting stuff that happened to us when we were young. Now, we grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, which is, as you know, the home of the University of Kentucky, which is where Jesus would have played basketball if Jesus had played basketball. It's my first Mass, you can't kill me yet. I'm sorry, I had to throw that in. It just, anyway. God love all you other teams. And we lived in a subdivision that was known as Gardenside Estates. And the actual, part that we were of really wasn't a huge number of homes. And most of this was built in the late 1950s and early 1960s. They were ranch homes on, decent-sized lots. And as I look back on it, and we were talking about some neighbors that we remembered and some of the things that happened there, I can actually look back at that time with a lot of fondness. It was a very safe place. We could ride our bikes in the street. We didn't have to worry about probably anybody harming us. We had neighbors, and within reason, we kind of got to know one another. But it was another era. It was what I call the movement from the front porch neighborhood, or what people call sitting on the stoop, where being outside, relating to the neighbors, was maybe sort of a daily way of life. We were part more of a generation that activity kind of moved to the backyard. And as time went by, I think things began to evolve. We all got central air conditioning, so we shut our windows in the summer. We didn't have to come to the porch in order to stay cool. So life was a little bit different. We maybe didn't hear one another as much, which in some cases, when the neighbors were fighting with each other, that was not automatically a bad thing. But it's fascinating to think of that and to realize that in that time, again, we can remember lots of fun things, the games we played, the quirky folks we had living around us. And as I like to recall, Gardenside Estates Central Intelligence Agency that was made up of Mrs. Finney, Mrs. Bruce, and Mrs. Williams. Nothing happened in Gardenside Estates without their knowledge. But this was the 1960s and 1970s. So in the culture of Lexington, Kentucky, there were boundaries. There were boundaries. The neighborhood we lived in at that time was all white. Very few African Americans lived in that part of the city. At that point in time, there were no Hispanics. There were no other variations. It was pretty much all the same type of neighbor. So when it comes to my understanding of what it means to be neighbor, I realized I started out with one model. And then as I got older, I moved to Evansville, Indiana, and lived there for many years. That changed. It was a much more culturally and racially diverse neighborhood. Some of the people I lived with were wonderful, very friendly. I really got to know them. Some of them were, as we might say, entrepreneurs who sold certain pharmaceutical products out of their own home. So I learned some neighbors you didn't want to necessarily get close to. And you kept your doors locked and your windows locked. You were careful. And I offer this because I think it's a big part of the mindset. We have to ask ourselves how we grew up, our neighborhoods, the people around us, whether there were lots of family or friends, or whether you were in one of those places where maybe you really didn't know the people that even lived next door to you. which I think happens more and more. We buy a house, we move into a place, we don't necessarily think about becoming part of a neighborhood anymore. So take a moment and think about that, because I really believe it is vital to our understanding of what we hear today in the gospel. This amazing encounter that's described there, where the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan both approach this man, and they respond very differently, is certainly an example we can relate to. In our world, most of us have cell phones. We see someone in distress, dial 911, and often keep driving. We don't necessarily have to engage people to really help them. Not that that's a bad thing, but it reflects a change. Jesus very much knew about what it meant to live in community and in a neighborhood. Those areas where he grew up in and spent most of his time ministering physically weren't that big. And there really weren't even that many people. And you had to know about each other. You didn't go in at night and close your doors and have no contact with your neighbor. You were known by the work you did, how you treated other people, who your children were, how your kids interacted with other kids. Those were very important values. And yes, we certainly keep some of those today. But the fascinating part about that interaction, I think, is that many of the same fears, many of the same boundaries that we would draw, whatever those might look like, when it comes to helping a neighbor or getting close to someone, those did exist back then. The man that was lying there in the ditch had been stripped of his clothing. He couldn't be recognized by the people who had passed by. So no one knew where he was from. They had no idea. And so on one level, I imagine there was compassion, but at the same time, a certain amount of fear. Boundaries were very tightly drawn in that world. If you were a good Jew, you didn't go to Samaria. Those were the not so good folks. But the one who is compassionate, the one who shows mercy, is the Samaritan. That's the powerful part. But I think the challenge, as it is always with the gospel, is to look at our lives, where we are here right now, and to think, how do we define that question? Who are our neighbors? Who do we care for? Who are the strangers or the people among us that we might take a step back from? And sometimes maybe for good reason. There are people out there who will harm us. We know that. But the powerful call here that I think Jesus gives us, and we can still relate to today, we've got to go farther. The lawyer was looking for a way to qualify it. He was hoping Jesus would say, oh, well, those people are your neighbors, but, those guys, nah, don't worry about them. Jesus doesn't do that. That call to compassion, to really being deeply and intimately connected with the world, with the people around us, with our families, with the people we work with, and even more challenging, the people that we're afraid of. The people that anger us, the people who have different political views, or they may come from different religious traditions. Whatever that is, Jesus has already let us know there are no qualifiers. There are no qualifiers. We are called to that level of compassion. And I'm here to tell you, as anyone could in this room, how difficult at times that can be. We live in a country that's in some ways much more connected globally, but yet at the same time distant. We text one another. We don't talk. We leave emails. Well, some emails. We don't connect in the same way. And that's not all bad, because for myself, I've been able to get in touch with family and loved ones in a different way than I would have been able to before. But again, the call here is connect, have mercy. Think to yourself who your neighbors are. Think to yourself what neighbors you really would rather omit. And then ask yourself, how can God help me to go deeper? Because there is a windfall here. Not just because the gospel says so, but because I think in our hearts, if we look and see, we realize the more we love one another, the more truly we will understand what it means to be a follower of Christ. More truly will we understand how the Holy Spirit is at work in us. More truly will we understand and appreciate the relationship that we have with God and what it is that we're called to. So the question I leave you with, who is your neighbor?